sometimes it's really not enough for me to do something good. I always want to do better, and I want to always push the boundaries of what is possible with my painting. And here we have an image of our model, Madeline, and I'm going to keep an image of her to the top left corner of your screen throughout the painting footage so that you can follow along with me as the painting develops. So what I'm doing is I'm working on a 24 by 30-inch cotton canvas. So I'll repeat those numbers. 24 by 30-inch cotton canvas. So I made the decision on this day to work on a much larger surface than I'm used to. So that is, I will be making a portrait of someone much larger than life size. So the general idea for this is that for the longest time I've been struggling with the smaller brushes, and getting into smaller shapes is just something I've not been able to do just because of the size of the brushes, the type of brushes, and whatever. So I decided to give this a try, working on a larger surface and using tons of paint and bristle brushes. And I'm starting pretty much with an Umber sketch, just as you've seen me work in previous videos. And if you're new to this channel and you want to know exactly what materials I'm using in terms of what oil paints and brushes and all of that information is going to be typed up for you in the description box down below. So one thing you'll notice right away is that I'm narrating this footage after the fact. So this is going to be voiceover style. So I will be essentially watching the video along with you and guiding you as I show certain painting footage. So just like I mentioned a few days ago, how I've been mentioning the fact that I want to share more with you, more of my life with you, and I think that this is really the first step in me showing you how I actually paint. So those of you that have been watching my videos for a very, very long time, if you've seen my Instagram account, so if you've been keeping up with the paintings that I do off camera, you will notice a difference. There is a noticeable difference between the way that the YouTube paintings are executed, not necessarily how they're executed, but you'll notice that there's a difference in the quality of the paintings, and this is something I've been well aware of for the longest time. Now, the important thing for me is to create content that can help you, content that can, videos that can help people. Now, the thing that I want to show more than anything is the reality of things. So the reality is that I do paint very, very differently, as I've mentioned before, when I'm not painting and talking at the same time, or even when I'm not really paying attention to the camera. Those of you that have painted or drawn or done anything on camera will know that it's a little different. There's a little bit of a psychological aspect involved when you know that there's a camera present. So with this painting, I didn't think too much about the camera. I had the camera off to the side. Sometimes the camera will be so far into the corner that the photo reference will not really help you. So I will be guiding you along through all of this after the fact so that I can give you a much stronger narration in terms of what I have been doing in the painting. So now with the painting, it's pretty simple to follow. What I have is a simple placement of the head. So right now I'm thinking more about the placement of the head, knowing that this is a fairly large canvas. Now it's not, you can't really see the full extent of the canvas because of the perspective. I am very close to the camera and the canvas is pretty far away from me. It's about at arm's length away from me, but you can tell that something different's going on with this canvas. One thing you'll notice is that my arm has to move quite rapidly. It was definitely a workout creating this painting because my arm has to move quite a bit to cover each area. And the idea, notice how I'm just moving my arms around. The idea, the basic premise is to have more working space, more real estate, so that I can fit in smaller shapes later. Because in reality, the way I actually paint is I try to make things more realistic than what you've been seeing in my YouTube paintings, and I try to make them more expressive. There's a little bit less of a, it's a little more difficult to follow, I think when you're watching me in my natural setting, my natural environment. But I will admit that I think this is probably the first time that I've ever, filmed a portrait painting and tried to ignore the fact that the camera was on me. Really, I'm really trying to give you the entire experience. Just like in, the video a couple days ago where I showed you Pepper, my bearded dragon, and yesterday we went to my portrait painting group, and again, I'm trying to show you more truth, more reality. Now, what I have here is an eraser brush. You're seeing now how I'm just kind of carving it along the side. And again, it's really important to use bristle brushes, especially when you're working in oil paint, when you're trying to paint something a little bit larger like this. So the bristle brushes, what they allow you to do is to pick up lots of paint and to kind of shovel it around. Notice how I'm working that angle between the eyes, just cutting right across. We will switch to synthetics. I'll switch to synthetics later on, and I'll explain why I transition from bristles to synthetics. But I tend to start off with the bristle brushes, and now I'm just trying to get an idea of the placement of the iris, the sclera. Not really trying to get into any kind of details just yet, though it may look like it. The idea of the Umber sketch, now the more and more I create these paintings, the more and more I realize certain elements, certain things don't really carry over too much into the final painting. So in the past I've said that certain things are useless, like trying to draw everything out and then filling in the shapes. I'm not trying to create a perfectly finished outline by any means, though I am describing quite a bit of information, suppose, in that eye to the left of your screen. But don't let it deceive you, because all of that information is going to be edited once I jump into color. And again, today's painting, so the painting that you witnessed in the beginning of the video, that was all painted in one day, several hours, okay? So I know that, I think it's important for you to have as much footage as possible, but for this painting in particular, I'm trying to fulfill that promise that I made in terms of showing you the reality of things. I want to bring you into my everyday life, and I want to establish this kind of working mentality amongst us all that we can push further. The idea is to push further than where we have been, and that's the idea of pushing the limits. Pushing the limits in terms of what I can paint not only involves trying to, draw with more accuracy, but it's also about what kind of story do I want the painting to tell. Now, here you're going to be seeing the camera at a very strange angle. I had to move it pretty far to the side because I kept, to be honest, I kept bumping into the camera, the tripod, so I had to move it to the side. And now what you're going to see is me drawing in the center line right there. That is the center line going across basically the center of the face. And now we have the angle between the mouth. I will admit that at the end of the day, the angle for the mouth is a little bit tilted, a little bit crooked, which it also is in the photograph, but I think that that's the probably photographic distortion. But during that day, I didn't really catch that. But in any case, let this be a reminder to you, especially if you're watching or listening to me while you're painting, stand back. So if you're painting and you're listening to me, stand back. Stand very, very far back. And if you're going to paint a portrait or a human head that is much larger than life, so if you're painting larger than life, oh yeah, stand back a lot. Stand back as much as you can. Now you can see that the drawing is kind of not that perfect, but the idea here is to get the placement of the head onto the canvas. And again, I've made videos such as breaking the rules, portrait painting tutorials and all of that stuff. So again, that technique is only one part of the painting process. It might be kind of weird, right? It's not that important to try to follow steps. It's not really about step by step. Step one, do this. Step two, do that. It's not about that. It's about knowing what you're looking for and trying to figure out what you want your painting to say. So right now, what I'm doing is with the clean and dry bristle brush, I'm just kind of softening all of the edges and trying to get rid of the excess mineral spirits. And so when you're working with lots of mineral spirits in the Umber sketch, like what I'm doing, you're going to have excess mineral spirits, and that's going to be not such a good thing on the canvas. So now after maybe about 15 minutes, the mineral spirits has dissipated a little bit. So now we're going to mix up our color value web on the palette. So I'm using a combination of kind of the earthier burnt umber, ivory black for my darker tones, and then my cadmium red, pearline red, and that right there is cobalt teal into the darker middle tone region of the palette, and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And now we're going into some yellow ochre as we venture off towards the middle tones. That was cadmium, yellow medium, cobalt teal, back to the yellow ochre. Now I'm going to switch brushes to a middle tone brush. So a little bit of my medium, and that medium again is Neo McGilp. And if you want to know exactly, what materials I'm using, if you're new to this channel, you can always go ahead and scroll down to the description box down below. And now we're using a little bit of flake white and cadmium orange. I'm sorry, the palette is actually kind of going off screen right there. I wasn't looking at my viewfinder, but in any case, lots of orange is going into the middle tones. And flake white is going to live somewhere in the middle tone region of the palette. Titanium white is going to live in the lighter values. Notice how I'm throwing in quite a bit of flake white, and notice how it's not raising the value that much. That is the property that flake white has. That is, you can use much more of it without raising the value too much. And notice how I raised it tremendously with the same amount of titanium white. It's a huge difference between the flake white and the titanium white. Now, flake white is going to live, again, primarily in the middle tones. And I showed you that close-up of the palette, the mixing of the color value web, because all of the flesh tone mixtures that I'm going to create are going to be essentially in the same fashion, just using different colors. So I'm going to tweak, say this color, I want to tweak it more blue, I'll use the cobalt teal. If I want to tweak it more red, I'll use the Peryline Red or Alizarin permanent. And the idea is to create a painting in which the flesh tones are well studied but not copied. And I want to relate all of these shapes to one another. Now, the real thing that I'm trying to do here, to be honest with you, is to sculpt out the forms in this eye, the eye to the left. I'm going to use that as an anchor point. And again, you've seen plenty of my painting videos, or if you're new to this channel, my older painting videos, and pretty much most of my painting videos in general. I don't usually start off with an eye and then work my way around. Now again, I'll let you in on a little secret. When I'm painting on my own, so not worrying about a camera or anything like that, I actually don't follow script. I do many different things that I wouldn't normally say that I would do. Now, the way you approach a painting doesn't matter. What matters is the fundamentals, understanding the concepts behind form, your orientation of values, your color relationships. The fundamentals matter, but the way that you apply those concepts doesn't. And that's the important thing to take out of this, because a lot of us, if you're new to painting, if you're new to drawing, if you're just getting into this, there is a ton of information telling you exactly what to do and how to do it, especially if you're going to an art school, like a classical art school, an atelier, or something like that. And listen to your teachers, it's important, but I will suggest break the rules sometimes. Just do things very, very differently and paint out of feel. After a while, you're using your mind, you're thinking of, different color combinations like that cobalt teal, yellow ochre, giving me a kind of dark blue, but that's not as dark as ultramarine. Keep all of the technique in the back of your mind, but let your creative expression flow. Let the creativity flow. Know that you're after certain things, such as light and shadow, halftone, and color variation. But again, try to let your creativity flow. Now, let's go ahead and continue describing what I'm doing. So now I'm just establishing my main dark. So that is the dark for the pupil of the eye. Right next to it, you have a dark for the concavity of the eye socket. And now I'm raising the value a little bit more alongside the corner of the side of the eye socket. And there's a lot of flake white in these mixtures. So what I'm trying to do here is get as much of a structure as I can just to feel the entire three-dimensionality of the eye. Notice as things are going darker, I'm describing planes that are turning away from the light. And now as we move towards the sclera, that's going to be getting a little bit lighter, though I think the exposure is kind of high on the camera shot. Actually, later on I do drop the exposure a little bit, so you will see more subtlety in the lights. So right now the screen looks rather flat, but in the actual painting, there's a little more depth in the values. And now I'm going to do the same thing, pushing the darks, that is, with the other eye. And using a little bit of sap green for the iris, just trying to get a little bit of a greenish tint onto the eyes. And notice how you can see that I'm solidifying the outlines. That's why in the Umber sketch stage, I think that at a certain point with the Umber sketch, you really don't want to finish the outlines that much. You want to leave room for the color and to build from the inside out, so to speak. So even at this stage, I'm not worried about a perfect outline or anything like that. I'm looking for these dark values, these dark accents, and I'm trying to make them as descriptive of the form as possible, because after all the values, the large value relationships are said and done, filling in the outline, so to speak, putting in the outline, the boundaries of the form, is actually not that difficult working in that way. So in a sense, I'm trying to not make it like a coloring book. I don't want to have to perfectly finish the outlines and then have to come back in and just fill in the shapes. That's not really what I wanted to do at this point. And another thing I've been told previous times, or many times, when narrating in this style, the voiceover style, is that I tend to speak a little bit too much. So I'm going to pause in some moments, just like I would be when if I were painting live, that is, painting and talking at the same time. So what we're doing here with the forehead now is basically just trying to map out some of the planes. Even though in the photograph the forehead looks kind of flat, I am trying to put in a little more three-dimensionality into the forehead, meaning this area right here is going to get darker and actually softer for the hairline. And it's going to get lighter towards the left side of the forehead relative to your screen. And then what I'm trying to do with this stage is push color a little bit. Now I am going to change you'll notice the exposure will change at some point in this footage. So it is kind of bright, but you'll notice that what I'm trying to do is push the sense of the warmth in the flesh tones. You can see right there in the glabella how it's getting warmer, and I'm actually going to push it cooler than perhaps I see it on the side plane of the forehead. Notice I used a little bit of cobalt teal on the side of the forehead there. And right above there we have the frontal ridge of the forehead, and now we have the forehead pretty much covered. So usually you see me start off with the forehead, especially if I start off with the Umber sketch stage. But from my previous experience with these paintings, I've painted hundreds of portraits and probably close to hundreds of portraits on film now. The thing is, from experience, I've learned that it is possible for me to spend too much time on any one individual area, especially this early in the painting, so you will see me very quickly move into the bottom planes. Notice how with a little more of the alizarin, we're starting to put in a touch of a warmer hue towards the cheekbones. The forehead tends to be a little bit, I don't know, closer to the yellowish color family. The cheekbone around the cheeks tends to be a little bit warmer and then cooler as it progresses towards the mandible. And in the photo reference, there's almost none of that. And I know this from nature because I have painted this model from nature, and the way I got the photo reference was uh, to attend a portrait painting group in Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, and Madeline was nice enough to allow me to photograph her. But anyway, the color variation that I'm putting in is based on my memory, based on observing the model from nature, as opposed to trying to copy the photograph. But I'm also trying to push the color variances more than I see them, just because I think that it adds much more, it conveys more of an interesting touch, so to speak, with the visual quality or the aesthetic of the painting. Sometimes it's just more fun to see a painting where you observe certain color temperatures are pushed. But the idea is not to push them too far, so that's why I like to use something that's not as strong. Um, like the cadmium green is a really nice tinter. So I have cadmium green off to the side of the cheekbone, and then it gets cooler with the pearline red as we move towards the lighter planes of the cheekbone. And as you can tell, we're kind of working from the inside out. So the more planes of color that I'm putting into the face, the more the outlines start to obtain more specificity. And I will tell you, working on a larger canvas, this is a 24 by 30 inch cotton canvas. Again, painting a head that's much bigger than life actually gives me a lot more control over the shapes, just because I don't have to worry about looking for a teeny tiny brush to fill in certain shapes. If I were painting on an 11 by 14 inch cotton canvas, like you usually see me paint, at this point I would be struggling a little bit with, getting the shapes for the nostril, so to speak, the bottom of the nostril. And instead, I think the smallest filbert I used was probably a size 4 filbert, which is actually fairly large when you're thinking of painting on a 11 by 14 inch cotton canvas. Again, like I mentioned before, we will get into the smaller synthetic brushes later on. And what you're seeing here is me actually adding more cobalt teal into the shadow, because I do, even in the photo reference, photographs are fairly limited in terms of their the range of colors, especially when you're photographing people. But the photograph does have some positive things in terms of color. I did see much cooler tones in the shadow, and that's because there are windows present. So there is some natural light influencing the shadow, in particular on the nose. So that's why I put in that cobalt teal. This is kind of interesting to me, watching the painting footage and guiding you through it, knowing that you're watching the footage. It's almost like we're here at the same time, watching the painting after the fact. It's almost like a podcast. You can consider it like an art cast, but I don't know. What do you think? Do you like this style of filming? And again, I'm going to, like I said, I always said I would mix things up. I would show you voiceover, and then I would paint live, meaning I would not live stream, but I would paint and talk at the same time. But I kind of like this. It's very relaxing, though it does take more time with editing. Now we're looking at the philtrum, and I literally just painted in the shape. So that shape that you're seeing right there is for the philtrum. Now the philtrum is the connection between the root of the nose and the top middle portion of the mouth. and I'm looking at the curvature of the T cylinder for the mouth, so the cylindrical shape of the mouth. You can think of forms as cylinders. You can generalize them, that is, as cylinders, or you can generalize them as more geometric solids like rectangles and such. Or you can use a sphere for a curvature that's consistent throughout. But the mouth right there, so the curvature throughout the side of the mouth is much more cylindrical than circular, meaning that the curvature is not constant. Now, a circle is a form, it's a solid where the curvature is constant throughout the entire structure, but it's not the case with the cylinder. A cylinder embedded within the structure of the face. So what I'm trying to say is that it's curving much more down here, see this? So it's curving much more rapidly around the side of the mouth, and then the curvature starts to slow down as we approach the cheekbone. So that's why you're seeing, me applying these values across the side of the mouth. So the values will transition much more noticeably around the mouth and much more subtly around the cheekbone. So that's what I mean by the curvature is different. And let me insert a little question of the day. I haven't done this in a long time. Uh, have you ever painted a portrait larger than life? So you can think of like Chuck Close. Chuck Close would be an example of artist that paints faces that are much larger than life. And there's a very interesting psychological thing, this larger than life thing that happens when you paint a human head that's larger than life. It's almost like looking at like when you walk into the movies, you see like these large posters. It almost felt that way, like I was trying to advertise some kind of movie. And I enjoy that kind of illustration aspect sometimes. And again, we are trying to tell a story. So again, with the chin, I'm putting in more planes, lighter planes for the chin. And I believe this is the longest. Let me double check. Yes, I think this is the longest clip. So this is the longest segment of the video where the camera is going to be in one consistent spot. But this will be the clip where you'll see most of the heavy work involved in putting in these shapes. The rest is going to be just nuance, just fine tuning and nuance. So with a little bit of Peryline Red, I am actually running out of that color. If you've never used Peryline Red, it's a really beautiful color. It's somewhere in between Alizarin and Cadmium Red, but it still maintains a very, should I say, chromatic aspect to it. Whereas if you mix Alizarin and Cadmium Red, I feel like it's not as bright, which is a really weird thing to say because Cadmium Red and Alizarin are very, very bright. But in any case, I am trying to describe a little bit of the color nuance that I'm using now. On my palette, there is a purple, a dioxazine purple, so I do sneak the purple in towards the nostrils. It's most likely impossible to see on the camera, just because the limitations of photography, but again, having an extended palette like the one I have is very useful for narrating, should I say, illustrating color. You can always modify color so long as you have the value relationships well understood. So I'm trying to describe kind of my thought process that was going on in this stage. I was pushing the color of the lips a little bit more pink perhaps than I saw in the photo reference. And now you're seeing the forms are starting to close up a little bit more. Notice the photo reference is gone because I felt like in editing, I felt like it's kind of useless because the camera, this portrait is so large. Look at the eye is almost as large as my fist. Like it's a very, very large face. So I think that putting the camera, well, at least when I was painting, I thought that putting the camera at this angle would show you a more interesting perspective just because you see my hand right next to the eye. Yeah, my hand is smaller than the nose of this portrait. And notice I'm switching now to synthetics. That is a synthetic size, I think size 2 round brush. And so synthetics are really good for steering the paint, steering it specific. Not necessarily good for adding loads of paint, but rather for putting in smaller, more refined, subtle edges, such as what you're going to see here. This is going to be one of the most fun aspects in painting an eye if you have it there. So the highlight that goes right in the middle of the sclera, the white of the eye, and the iris. It's always a nice thing when you have the highlight in between the sclera and the iris. I don't know why. It's just aesthetically a very appealing moment when that happens. And as you can tell, I have much more control over these smaller shapes, and that's what I wanted initially when I started this painting. I wanted to be able to provide a much more depth in the structures. Notice you can even tell the white of the eye, the sclera. You can even tell the curvature of the sclera, and look how close up. Look how close up we can get now. And again, this would be impossible for me if I were working on a smaller surface. I mean, it's never good to say impossible, but it would be very difficult. And here's another thing you've never seen me do. Eyelashes, or maybe you have, but yeah, eyelashes I usually never paint. But now I actually have the the leverage to be able to paint in the eyelashes. And I'm not going to try and make it perfect exactly like the photograph, because I do believe the photograph is flattening the eyelashes. They wouldn't be a uniform dark shape like it appears in the photo reference. Even the eyelashes would have planes, certain areas that are lighter, certain areas that are darker. And now as we're moving across, you can see now we're starting to close up all of the forms. And by closing up, I mean kind of adding that depth, that volume into the forms just like I wanted. And with the synthetic brush, I'm actually just trying to soften the contour around the side of the mandible. And just kind of push the paint around towards the neck. Because I do believe in this clip I'm actually going to fill in the structures for the neck, at least momentarily. And now you can actually see that I just threw in a little bit of the cadmium green. So even on the neck, I'm actually putting some more variation. And at this point, you're seeing now the contrast is a little deeper in the face. And that's because I did change the exposure. So the light sensitivity on the camera has been adjusted. So now you're seeing the optimal image. And a little bit of the greener tones. You can see I'm definitely pushing a little more green, though I am kind of disappointed in my monitor, at least the footage that I'm seeing now, because the actual painting itself has much more color variation, whereas it seems a little more muted on the computer screen. It'll probably seem a little more muted to your screen, but just know that I am pushing it greener along the side of the neck and more kind of like a lavenderish tone towards the mandible, just to contrast the greens, and then the blues in the shadow. And even the shadow does have some ultramarine blue and cobalt teal in it, the shadow beneath the mandible, though you can't really see it, unfortunately. And that value change that I put in is for the neck, the muscle for the neck. The sternocleidomastoid, you're seeing it kind of like a tube-like structure on one side, and on the other side, right here, it's actually more subtle, but much less evident in the photo reference. So again, in a way, we're definitely trying to go beyond the information provided by the photo reference using our understandings of concepts, the understanding of the fundamental concepts involved in creating these structures. And now we're going to put in a little bit of ivory black in our medium Neo McGilp, and a little bit of dioxazine purple actually into this mixture here. And I will admittingly put a little bit of mineral spirits just to get the paint to flow a little bit more, so you saw it off camera. And again, this is I thought this was a really interesting camera angle where you can really see like the depth of the painting and how huge that painting is, how huge the face is relative to my body. I mean, like the head is almost as big as my torso. So it's a very interesting thing to see, and that's why I did have the photo reference, I didn't have the photo reference in that shot. So now with a little bit of ivory black and alizarin permanent, and even more alizarin permanent, and even a little bit of Peryline Red. Admittingly, I will put a little bit of odorless mineral spirits later on to add more fluidity to the paint, but it does have much more Neo McGilp medium. And again, if you're new to the channel, Neo McGilp is a fast drying medium, but it's a gel-like medium that allows that increases the fluidity of the paint. I hope you're enjoying these camera angles, even though the photo reference isn't in all of these shots. And I was really trying to focus much more into the imagery in this painting, really trying to create the best painting possible, and also trying to get the best painting footage possible, even though I wasn't too focused on the camera. I was focused on trying to get certain shots from the side, just so it can have a little more of a cinematic look. And you can see kind of like a zigzag that I'm putting into the clothing. And I'm going to let a lot more mineral spirits go onto the bottom of the painting, just so it'll kind of start to drip later on. And you probably saw it in the beginning of this video. If you go back to the beginning of this video, you'll see kind of some dripping for the bottom of the shirt. And that's just the mineral spirits kind of dripping through. And at this stage when I was painting that, I knew that would happen. I thought it would be a very interesting touch just to have that effect. And again, it's not really like trying to copy I'm not trying to copy the image I'm looking at. You can clearly tell at this point. And I'm still trying to have kind of like little momentary pauses in between with my narration, just so I don't overwhelm you too much with my voice. But I think that's going to be mostly it for the face. Now what I'm going to do is, with a smaller brush, the ultramarine blue and a little bit of the titanium white. That was probably too much titanium white, so again to the ultramarine blue. We're just going to put in some smaller details, and we're going to put in the nose ring. See how with pretty much a single brush stroke, when you're working in this technique, the wet on wet, that is applying a wet layer of paint on top of another wet layer of paint, it really does lend itself quite nicely to putting in these smaller details with great facility. Very, very simple. And we'll just throw in a little highlight there. Titanium white, ultramarine blue. And I'm pretty tired now after all of that painting. So again, this whole thing was painted in one day, really just to push myself, really to push the limits of what I can do, in one day. And maybe, maybe I would want to do other things like tweak some of these structures around here. But I'm pretty satisfied with the result. I think that I really did push myself to another level in terms of the way I wanted to paint. Now, of course, like I always say, it's not about creating a perfectly photographic image. As you can see, that And, I pushed some of these color variations beyond the photograph. I pushed and I softened certain edges. So of course I'm never trying to recreate a photograph ever. That's never what I'm trying to do. That being said, in a world that can be so negative, be the spark that ignites positivity amongst all of us. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll be back again very soon.